I love a good natter, don't you? I love a good natter. I love a good conversation. I love a conversation in which you can sort of go off on a whole different, I don't know, different spectrum. You start somewhere, and before you know it, an hour or so later, you've had a conversation with somebody. You covered so many things. It's been intellectually interesting and stimulating and a bit of fun. Are you somebody who does that? Did you talk to your partner? Do you actually talk to your partner? I've had relationships in the past which have had fantastic conversations. I used to know a young lady that I used to stay with, and we would have a meal and we would chat about, I don't know, politics or things that were going on in the town or things that were affecting either one of us, you know, those important things in life. And after the meal, she had a dishwasher. And she would say, oh, just shove them in the dishwasher and we'll go and sit in the other room. But going and sitting in the other room, other than the kitchen area where we were eating, meant sticking the television on, which was a killer of conversation. So I would say, no, sorry, I'll wash it up by hand. I wash up by hand at home. And that way it stimulated continued the conversation to... It enabled, let me start that again, use English, which would be nice. It enabled the conversation to continue. So we would have been sitting there chatting about something, and then perhaps that subject dropped and we moved on to something else. And instead of just killing that conversation, I would then start washing up. And of course, you would stay in there in the kitchen area. The washing up would have been done ages ago. The plates and dishes would have been put away ages ago. But that conversation continued. And an hour or so later, you're going, oh, right, well, what should we do now? Should we go for a walk and do something else other than sitting down and surrendering to the box in the corner? So do you have a conversation, intellectual conversation? And what sort of things do you talk about? Or are you one of those people that you've been in a relationship for a long time with your partner and you just don't? You just no longer have anything more to say? Or is it difficult to stimulate your partner into talking about things? I think I'm somebody, with all the different relationships that I've had, have been somebody who's wanted to talk about issues when they come up. And sometimes that surprises the people I'm with. I will say, look, let's just talk about this for a minute, because let's get these things on the table so we all know where we're coming from and what our opinion is on this. Because if you don't talk, particularly with your partner, about certain personal things, the subject that you want to talk about, which you felt you couldn't talk about for ages and ages and ages, grows bigger and bigger, and it's more difficult then to broach the subject. But if you are somebody who is able, even if you're talking around the subject, that you eventually get to the subject, if you are somebody who continually talks about things and is open about things and can pin the other person down on things, and you can have your opinion pinned down as well, then I think the bigger conversations become much easier to chat about. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on all of that. What do you think? Are you able to have those conversations? Are there conversations, for example, you have with your children that perhaps are more difficult? You know, you want to address something, and how do you go about it? I always think it's quite fun to, if you've got difficult conversations, particularly with a partner, is to say, look, I want to have a chat to you about something. It's a bit tricky, but let's go out and have a meal in a pub, or we'll have a drink in a pub, or I'll go to a cafe or somewhere into a third person's environment to have that conversation, rather than at home where there's too many distractions. Because when you sort of have a chat at home, obviously you can be sitting around the table, or you're just standing, or you elicit the beginning of a conversation, and your partner, who may or may not want to have this conversation, but it's an important conversation that you've got to have, may well sort of go, I've actually got to do this because that's very important, or actually that light needs changing, or find a myriad of excuses not to have the conversation, or, well, I'm a bit busy at the moment, we'll chat about it later. And whereas if you orchestrate the situation where you're out and you're sitting down in a cafe and you go, this is lovely, we've got a nice cup of tea. Oh, by the way, I did want to ask you this question about such and such, and I wonder if we can thrash this out. That's to me, in my mind, and I may be wrong, and you may have got different ideas on this, a perfect place to have those slightly difficult conversations. And also, I think if you've got a series of conversations that you know you need to have, starting small around those difficult conversations and slowly building up. So your partner is used to you bringing up the subject and not necessarily going for the killer question straight away. And I think that's important. We all have these conversations that we need to do, and communicating with one's partner or one's children, I think, is very important. It's that thing about having the children around the family table at meal times, which does seem to be a thing of the past, and I readily admit was something missing from my children's background because of the nature of my house. 3 children and a 2 up, 2 down. We didn't have a dining room. And the kids have sort of got used to watching the telly and balancing food on their plates. And I realised that this is not really a great thing, but because you really want to try and get back to that family unit in which, and I'm not telling you what you should do, by the way. I'm just saying, in my mind, this does seem to have been a good way of getting the family together and talking about the things that have happened that day to elicit conversation. The fact that you're talking about, maybe the boring things. How was school? It was okay. It was good. Well, what does that mean? It was good. Trying to get the kids to talk, I think, is absolutely brilliant, because talking and conversation gets the mind working. It forces you to think about things, and then not only just think about them, but try and get what is a sort of weird notion in your head into a series of words strung together to make a sentence that will communicate that concept and idea that's in here, so that somebody else can take those words and then return it back into a concept and idea. By elucidating on a subject, by pulling it out of your head and trying to actually turn it into a language that can be explained, not only helps the person opposite you, who you're talking to understand what you're saying, but it also, I think, helps you to understand what is that sort of very vague, fuzzy notion thing that, oh yeah, it was all right. It's not until you start to communicate verbally, I think, or if you're writing a diary, that you're putting things into words so that you can communicate to that the more detail comes. So just talk, you say, what was the school day like? Yeah, it was good. Well, what do you mean by good? What sort of lessons did you have? Well, I did maths and English and such and such. And anything interesting in the maths class? Well, actually, yes. It was funny because the teacher slipped on a bar of soap and broke his head and had to go to the hospital. And it's like, well, that was interesting. And did the ambulance come, and what happened here and what happened there? Excuse me. And all those sort of things. Suddenly, it doesn't really matter that they're not necessarily, your child is not telling you initially what you wanted, as in what did you learn at school, but they're having a communication in which the pair of you are engaging on a subject and enjoying it. It's that sense of enjoyment that you can talk about something and both of you are enjoying the exchange of ideas. Well, what do you think about that? Well, I thought it was dreadful. Why? It's funny because I don't think that's so dreadful. I think it's quite nice that we do this. Oh, do you? Because in this world at the moment, we seem to be in a polarized situation that if you have any kind of opinion on something and you tell it to somebody who has the opposite opinion or is variants of opinions on that in this world we seem to be taught that actually anybody who thinks differently from you is an idiot. And that's so not true. People have a difference of opinions. For example, I've had viewers, I was talking about this to the lovely Julia yesterday, I have had viewers who've watched the content that I put out on the Bald Explorer particularly, and indeed on the Vogue show when we were doing live streams, and you would say one thing, and I've had them go, oh, you mentioned, for example, one person I happened to mention, do you know what? I don't buy into the global warming thing. I personally don't. I know the scientists say it's a closed down thing, which is one reason why I don't believe it, because I don't think science is ever definite, that there is always room for a new, hypothesis, that there's a new, we don't know everything. We think we know stuff, but there's always room for something, variance, or a new thing that will change that. We know, for example, in archaeology, we think that we know a lot about the animals and when they roamed, and then a fossil will be found that will say, well, bloody hell, look at that. This animal we thought was in this millions of years ago, and then it turns out it's only in this hundreds of thousands of years ago, which changes everything. So being open in science, I think, is absolutely the essential. You can't be closed. So when you have an argument like, well, is global warming man-made and how much? And you say, well, I just don't buy into it. It just doesn't sit right with me. And someone says, well, the science is closed and you're an idiot. This is that polarizing conversation. And instead of that, you really want somebody saying, well, look, all the science is there, it seems. Why do you not believe it? You say it doesn't sit comfortably with you. Why not? Why not? And so you can have a debate about it and talk about it, and ultimately you can go, well, I still think you're wrong, or I can see why you think that, but I don't think that myself, and you can still be friends. But in this polarized world, you have an opinion, and somebody else will just go, well, you're an idiot, and they want nothing more to do with you. And I've had listeners and viewers to my various outputs who I say something, I have an opinion, and they go, well, you're an idiot. And then they don't want to know. They've agreed with so many other things, and there's so many other things in common, but they've just suddenly gone, I'm not going to be your friend anymore. I don't want to watch your shows. I don't want to have anything to do with you because of one thing. And I think this is where conversation, the importance of conversation, of listening, because conversation is made up of two elements, isn't it? It's expressing what you've got to say, but it's also listening, which is the most important part, to the other person. And not only, it's not just hearing it, but it's actually listening and thinking about what they've just said. So if you're in a deep argument, like your typical putting the world to rights type of argument that you might have down at the pub, and go, oh, well, I don't know about this new Prime Minister, Liz Truss. I think she's not going to be able to do anything about it. And it's like, well, why? Why do you, well, I think this, and this. You've got to listen to the other person, because not only if you don't listen to them, you can't appraise their train of thought, and you can't then ask perhaps piercing questions. You say, well, it's interesting you say that, but why? You seem to follow this line of thought, but you don't follow that line of thought. Now, a lot of people get a bit upset with me because I very often, when having a conversation with somebody, if we're getting into something quite technical or sort of very belief structured, and I often hear things that don't quite sit right, or they'll use a phrase which is a bit of a catch-all phrase, and I'll say, well, what do you mean by that? Because I don't really understand. What does that actually mean? Because I think a lot of times people use phrases that they assume somebody else will know, but also I think they use the phrases they think they know what they mean by that actual phrase. And then when I will say, okay, but I don't know, what do you mean by that? And then they're having to explain a phrase which they may have just read in a book or in a newspaper or in something like that and go, well, I don't really know, actually. It's like net zero is something that is bandied about. And you say, well, what does that mean exactly? Precisely, what does it mean? That we will have no carbon whatsoever? Is that really what that means? That any kind of carbon, that means any animal that will add to the ozone layer, like a cow farting or something, are we going to eradicate everyone? And where do you stop the line? Because a fizzy drink, has carbonated water in it, and that carbon is is that what you mean? And so sometimes people do get annoyed with me because I'll be fairly forensically saying, well, what do you actually mean? But because I don't think people often have thought about some of the jargon that they use and actually what that means. And I'm probably just as guilty. So I'm interested. Do you have intellectual conversations with people? And does it change anything? Do you get any further with it? Do you just enjoy it for the fun of it? Are you somebody who loves a good talk? Or are you somebody who barely says a word? I know somebody who in whom's presence, is that English? In whose presence barely any words are spoken, and engaging in any form of intellectual conversation, even if it's just sort of small talk, is not there, and it's weird. I find that but it you accept the person for who they are, of course, and if they don't want to but you might occasionally find a subject that they know a lot about, and you will have a long conversation. So maybe you're one of those, great silent types who doesn't just talk, sees no point in engaging in conversation. Or perhaps you're others, a bit like me, that loves to, find what other people are thinking and share ideas and opinions. Be interested to know what you think. Anyway, that's the topic of the day. Let's have a look at some of the comments that people have said regarding some of the other topics that we've spoken about. Upgrades yesterday. Oh my goodness, I had a bit of a thing, and I still got one problem that continues that I can't work out how to fix, and it's driving me a bit bonkers, but luckily it's not an essential thing. Scott FW says, there are days when I'm quite content to be too poor and disabled to afford much of any technical stuff. And when I get to heaven, my expectation is that computers their never update. Sorry, it's difficult to read sometimes if the English is missing. And when I get to heaven, my expectation is that computers that never update because they were perfect to begin with. Right. Ivan70 says, good evening, Richard. As an engineer, whenever we were on courses, every time the trainers always banged on about updates. I found one update made some parts not reach the end of the quoted life. From that day on, I resisted any update. My take on this subject, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And I think, that is overall a good policy, isn't it? We sometimes meddle and try and improve things for the sake of something, and maybe the gain that we improve is not so much that worth the effort to have updated things. If they were, as you say, if it's not broken. Trevor Ford says, that's why I switched to Linux Mint. It's not that it's just that it's a far better operating system, he says with a laughing face. I have no idea what that is. Is that something you suck? Linux Mint. I've not heard of it. Alex Williams says, I found this so moving, and this is about can you cope being a parent, and wonderful, as everything you said was spot on. Oh, blimey, I'm not trying to be spot on, I'm trying to elicit a response. There's no point everybody agreeing with me, for goodness sake. However, I appreciate that. I too lament the loss of being needed and loved in the same way that we once were, like you. My children are late 20s and 30s. Indeed, I'm a grandmother of 3 now. It's all a learning curve, I guess, much like the rest of life. That's very true. Well, but I'm very pleased that you like that. And Mary Fennell says, updates are a pain in the butt. And yes, I agree, they are. And Shirley Lynch says, hate updates. They drive me nuts. Yesterday, TalkTalk, which is a telecoms company in the UK, wanted me to update my email settings. After a few questions to them, I decided it was a scam. They wanted my bank details. Well, of course, anybody who's asking for your bank details, if you're already a customer with somebody, why do they need your bank details? I thought something was funny, so I deleted their email to update. Great topic for a chinwag. Thank you very much. But Carl Chapman says, if you don't upgrade, you'll be left far behind in the world. And that's an interesting observation, isn't it? And in some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. And it's an open-ended debate, that. Some upgrades, I think, are absolutely essential. But every single moment, every single upgrade, sometimes it's just worth hanging on with the thing and going, look, because I get upgrades on various programs and it'll say, here's upgrade 00.2, 00.3, and blah, blah, blah. And you think, okay, I'll just go to the new fresh iteration of the whole program rather than all these minor little upgrades. However, I think techie people do like you to be upgraded. But sometimes it's nice just to, I question social media and the benefits of it, and I don't go on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and Twitter, and I don't have any of those. And actually, I quite like being left far behind in the world, because far behind to me is being in the here and now and not being worried about having to be with the latest and greatest and all of that. I'm quite content. And I think if you're quite content, you don't need all these upgrades. It's like you're continually searching for something. But I'm not really. So, each to their own. Anyway, there we go. Thank you very much. There's plenty more comments on the page. Do let me know in the comments on today's subject. Do you talk? Do you chat? Do you have conversation? Or don't you? Or how important is conversation to you? Be interested to know. Thanks for watching. Catch you soon.